Have you all watched Norseman on Netflix yet? I'm not personally recommending it because it has offensive things in it, and I'm obviously super against offensive things, but I know some very, very bad people who watched it and liked it, and if they were here, what they would want me to tell you is that the reason they think it's super funny is because it's like The Office meets Vikings, and you get all of the social dysfunction of this little village of Norsemen who go on raids and whatnot, but they're all Minnesota nice and very in touch with their feelings and very concerned about the feelings of others, and they all have that Norwegian thing going, and it's very disappointing when their village gets raided and they get taken away as slaves. Just the affectation alone, which I cannot do justice to, as I quote the bad people who like this show, who would recommend it if they were here, is enough to watch the program for. The whole thing is very funny according to these bad people. And one of the things that my bad friends who like this show tell me about it is that even though the whole thing is obviously a farce, it's still shocking how effective those Viking war speeches and rallying cries are, because it's the Viking mystique of we are going knowingly into the fray and into danger, and Valhalla awaits on the other side. And if my bad friends were here, the next word they would want me to say to you as we talk about the Vikings thing is, likewise, when we look at Matthew chapter 10, we've got this call to battle that is coming from Jesus. He's telling his disciples who he's sending out on this open world quest that this is going to be ugly. This is going to be bloody. You are going to hurt if you sign up to participate in this thing. But much like the Viking war rally where we know we're going off to possibly die in glory, it's worth it. And you should walk right into this thing understanding that it might be dangerous and it might be hard, and you're probably going to suffer for it. Which is interesting when you think about it, because if you look at Matthew chapter 10, it starts off so nice. It comes on the back end of all of these cool miracles, and everybody's super happy in chapters 8 and 9, except for maybe a couple grumpy people here and there. But most people are like, what? Miracles where diseases and demons go away and bad weather goes away? Like, this is great. Why wouldn't we want more of that? And then, oh, wow, the disciples realize in Matthew 10, we get sent out with this too. We get to be on team awesome stuff. This is great. But then it takes a little bit of a pivot into, whoa, okay, well, some people might not like it. And whoa, God's judgment might show up. That's kind of freaky. And then it really takes a pivot on the, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves in verse 16. Therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. Whoa, sheep among wolves don't even have a chance. This is kind of freaky. And then we get into verse 17, the second chunk of this thing. And he says, be on your guard against men. They will hand you over to the local councils and flog you in their synagogues. And what's going to jump off the page to us as a modern audience is the self-preservation, litigiously oriented societal assumptions that we have today about avoiding risk at all costs. That's just when we live. It's a byproduct of being a part of the age of technology, when we have the ability to mitigate a lot of the bad things, the discomforts, maybe the really scary things of life, not all of them, but some. And so as a result, we expect to not face those things down. And why would you ever just voluntarily go into danger? I have to admit, I thought that at a high ropes course that I was on 2 days ago here. I brought my family out and we climbed up this ladder and we're all clipped into stuff. And we get to this one place where you take a zip line out of the forest to one pine tree. It's just forever out there, like in the parking lot. And it's the highest point on the whole course. Now, I've been cruising through everything. Everybody had, but we all got there and there was kind of this gulp as we realized I'm going out to that tiny little island of altitude in the middle of nowhere with no ladder down. I really hope this works out. And the no safety net thing really does get in your head a little bit. And as I was standing out there watching my beloved, precious, wonderful family each clip into everything and to suspend themselves by one piece of wire to come sliding toward me, I sort of thought, like, why did I voluntarily bring us to this? We didn't have to do this. And now here we are clinging to a tree in the middle of nowhere, hoping that we don't fall off and die. And of course, everything worked out fine. It was a completely safe place and it was a lot of fun. But here, again, I'm sure the disciples at least had it cross their mind at this point as Jesus is talking about floggings and wolves. We don't have to do this, though, do we? Because most people haven't signed up. So we could just be a part of the people group that is not signed up, and then we don't have to walk into this thing. But again, like the Vikings that feel it is right and good to go and boldly face down pain, discomfort, suffering, even death because of their code of beliefs, it would seem all the more so that these guys are at the beginning of a journey, spiritually, mentally, where they come to the conclusion that, yeah, they want to wade into it too, that it's completely worth it. They're running a different math equation in their head about the value of their lives versus the value of this cause, this thing they're a part of. It's a different equation than most of us run at any given time. And so what's wild is we get to the end of Matthew chapter 10 and discover that nobody bailed. I mean, eventually, I guess Judas kind of bails, and he has a really unfortunate experience on the high ropes course. But everybody else sticks with it, and they go to very ugly deaths at the hand of others, just exactly the way Jesus said, which means that Jesus wasn't blowing smoke here. He was disclosing. He was turning over his cards. Once again, here's exactly how this is going to play. It's going to be ugly. On my account, you'll be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. But when they arrest you, don't worry about what to say or how to say it. Well, okay, so we kind of round the corner here between the two verses I just read, verses 18 and 19. So we're still on the unfun disclosure side. On my account, you'll be brought before governors and kings as witnesses to them and to the Gentiles. So it sounds like a pretty big privilege. But when you know that they're going to be flogging you, it makes it a little less fun. And that does turn out to be true. Most of that unfolds in the second half of the book of Acts, as we see followers of Jesus end up in front of Sergius Paulus, which goes pretty well. That's actually more in the early to middle going of Acts. And then we see them end up before Felix and Festus. That's what Paul endures toward the end of Acts. We see an encounter in the middle of Acts between James and Peter and Herod. That one does not go well for either of them, particularly bad for James, who has his head unseated as a result of that encounter. And then Nero would have been the emperor to whom Paul famously appealed after not getting satisfaction or justice from his conversations with Felix and Festus, the Roman governors who came along after Pontius Pilate as his successors that held Paul under house arrest in Caesarea Philippi. And then very famously and very specifically to the prediction that you'd be brought before these councils and synagogues and get flogged, we have two instances that stand out in the early goings of Acts where the disciples are still in Jerusalem. Jesus is gone. They're like, well, I mean, he said we were supposed to be his witnesses starting in Jerusalem, so I guess we'll just go to the temple and hang out here in the colonnades around the temple, and we'll talk about stuff and explain the Jesus thing to people like Jesus explained to people, and it goes okay, but it also really irritates the religious leaders, and so they call them in and scold them and tell them to stop, and then they get released. And then Acts 4:23, on their release, Peter and John went back to their own people and reported all the chief priests and elders had said to them. They go on to say a bunch of stuff about like, yeah, we're not dissuaded at all. And they go right back out and keep teaching just like they were before. Then in chapter 5 of Acts, the religious leaders are like, we told you to stop. We're in charge of the thing that when we say the things, you have to stop. You have to do the thing that we say. And then Peter fires right back. And over the course of 2 shots back, he basically says, this Jesus, you guys are the ones who crucified him, and he was the Messiah. And of course, that makes everyone very mad. And then a reasonable member, a guy named Gamaliel of the Sanhedrin, that's the religious leadership council of the day, comes along. He's like, hey, okay, let's take a chill approach. If it's not from God, it'll go away quickly like all the other wannabe disciples of wannabe messiahs. But if it is from God, there's nothing we can do about it anyway. So then in verse 40, we see that Gamaliel's speech persuaded the Sanhedrin, and then the Sanhedrin called the apostles in and had them flogged. Then they ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. It's just your run-of-the-mill casual flogging. Like, that's what it looks like to be persuaded. What would not persuaded have looked like? I mean, flogging is pretty bad. And then I have to think this is in keeping with what they just heard Jesus say a couple years earlier over here in the passage we're looking at in Matthew 10. It says, then the apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing, because they'd been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Day after day in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. Now think about this. Let's say Jesus doesn't disclose. And he's like, I don't want to lose these guys. want to nurture them along and keep them pretty excited and energized about the product. And so I can't tell them about the floggings and stuff. So he just skips all of this. He's like, hey, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, but don't worry, it's like metaphorical wolves. It's not going to be a problem or anything. You guys have got this. It'll be just fine. Don't worry. It's not like it's going to hurt. Well, then they're horribly ill-prepared. And how would they have responded differently when they did get flogged repeatedly, when they got arrested repeatedly, when some of them started getting executed? That still happened within the time of the Bible. Well, I don't know. I think they would have been like, what gives? You said this thing was going to be great and people were going to sign up. You didn't tell us it was going to end like this. I didn't want to get stabbed. This is just stupid. I'm excited about your religion and everything, but now my back looks like hamburger. Now, how is that part of the deal? I would not have signed up for that if I had known. No, instead, they're like high-fiving each other as the ooze and pus just runs out the back of their shirts as they stroll through town because they were worthy to be associated with the name of Jesus. And surely they weren't just remembering Matthew 10. Surely they were remembering the previous speech of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5. And verse 10, the end of the Beatitudes, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That was ringing in their ears, I promise you. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Surely all of that disclosure, all of that bad marketing plan that I've been griping about from Jesus all along. Dude, do you want people to sign up? Quit telling them they're going to get stabbed and flogged and stuff. Tell them how much stuff they get and how much fun it's going to be. But he insists on this plan, and what you get are enormously well-prepared disciples who are not only not surprised by the wolves and the flogging and the pressure of being in front of these powerful people, but they are elated to share in the suffering of their king. Because why? Well, they believe that he is the king. Before today, much like the Vikings of yore, who my bad friends tell me about in the Netflix program where they are depicted, charge bravely into chaos and melee and death and battle, knowing that something greater awaits them and there's a greater cause to all of it, and they are not afraid. So the disciples are going into something that they understand even more clearly, having actually encountered who they believe to be the God who stands behind that promise. They're convinced of that promise, and so they know they're walking into the fray, and they think it's totally worth it, and that is a really crucial thing to understand in order to wrap our brains around what is happening throughout the course of the New Testament and the early church. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.